In this era of grave spiritual crisis, it is not enough to simply know about your Catholic faith. That is why we need a Catholic toolbox to equip us with the practical skills necessary to live our Catholic faith to reach our ultimate goal, which is heaven for all eternity. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Join us every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. for the Catholic Toolbox as we hand you the tools to go forth, live the faith, and change our modern world today. Live on the Voice of Charity.
And welcome back to another week on the Catholic Toolbox, the art of practical Catholicism. I'm your host and founder, George Manassa, here as we equip you with practical tools to live your faith in our modern world of today. This week, we're going on Crusades with Daniel Hill. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks, George. I hope you got your books ready, your saddlebag ready for a wander.
Yes, I did. I went to the medieval fair on Sunday. And made a new acquisition of
That's very good.
a few acquisitions actually. It's always great to go there and immerse myself in medieval history. But it's great to have you back here on the show to discuss a very important topic. I think we've been wanting to do this for a while, to speak about the Crusades. I know it's a heated topic, and I don't think it was well taught when I was at school. You know, you hear about it, a few references in a typical textbook, and you don't hear many good things about the Crusades. You always hear there's always negativity around it, or the negatives or the abuses in the Crusades, but we never actually get a good grasp of the history of why the Pope declared the Crusades. And you're here to enlighten us. So we're going on crusade, you and I, today.
It's going on crusade about the Crusades.
Exactly.
And they've been badly misrepresented for a number of reasons throughout the last couple of maybe 100 years. Yeah.
Exactly. And let's start off. But why were the Crusades actually needed?
Well, that's a good question. So, and that's fundamental to understanding the Crusades, is why would the Pope request that the Knights of Europe go to Jerusalem? Why would they respond and do so? And maybe, George, remind me to talk about the kind of things that were happening in the world on the lead up to the First Crusade, to get a sense of kind of things that kind of indicate that Europe was going to go in that direction. But I mean, the fundamental answer to that question is because Europe had been, for a few hundred years, attacked and harried by Islamic expansion and conquest. And we're talking about the whole history of the rise of Islam, and that's probably something that your listeners can do more research into themselves. But we have the 7th century onwards, the Islamic religion, which is fundamentally based from Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, spread all throughout the southern Mediterranean and conquer all these Christian lands, former Christian lands that were part of the Byzantine Empire or the Roman Empire itself. The Byzantine Empire and the Roman Empire can be considered the same thing in many respects, just one continues from the other, right up into the middle of France. So they conquer the whole of Spain. They're only defeated at the Battle of Tours in the 700s, in 10th of October 732. So that's the experience, and it's not just there. You have Islamic pirates and navies harrying parts of of Europe from the sea, including Rome itself, Italy itself, and then you have the Battle of Manzikert in 10 when was it? 1070, in the 1070s.
Yeah.
And that is the last straw in a sense, because the Byzantine Empire, which has had a huge amount of its territory taken away, constant attack, their last major army is defeated, and they
Yeah.
get pushed right up to Constantinople essentially. And we get the beginning of all these requests for help being sent to the West to come and defend fellow Christians and come and defend the Holy Land. And so that's kind of where it starts. Does that answer your question, George?
It does, yeah.
Give
And
it a
it's
sense?
an
Yeah.
interesting point. At that point, there was the fall of Constantinople. Is that right?
Well, Constantinople didn't fall, but it was threatened. So they went up right up to Nicaea in Asia Minor.
Yep.
Of course, modern day Turkey, because the Islamic Turks, hundreds of years later did conquer Constantinople, and it's Istanbul now. But at that time, that hadn't happened. The 1070s, they were very worried that it would happen. And we had, so you have that going on in the east, and in the west, in Spain, they've been fighting the attack of the Moors, as they're called in Spain, and they continue to do so for a long, long time. So you've got kind of one side and the other
Yeah.
of the Christian world is being attacked by Islamic armies. And then, of course, in the Mediterranean, they could pop up anywhere as well. So this is what's happening. It's not, I suppose the response to that is, it's not, oh, they woke up one day and were really angry about Muslims and wanted to go and kill them. That is not.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that's what you're kind of taught. That's the kind of sense you get. There are reasons for that. We might talk about that at some stage.
Yeah.
But there are reasons for that. Yeah. I mean, the other thing, just to say, in the lead up to the Crusades, Europe itself has come out of the Dark Ages, which is actually a term that refers to a period of kind of turmoil and change that we're missing a lot of historic information. So it's dark. It's not because people wore brown and were sad and there was no sunshine.
Why
which a lot
was it
of people
dark?
don't have a sense of. Hey?
Why was it referred to as the Dark Ages?
That came from the idea that we're in the dark about it a little bit. The historical records aren't great.
Yeah.
It's got nothing to do with the fact that they thought people were stupid or dumb, or all those, or had gone into a state of significant ignorance. There are three different ways of saying the same thing that we get taught at schools. And the kind of the general sense is that's what the Dark Ages was. Even the word Middle Ages, which comes from the Renaissance, refers to this kind of people who thought they were much more intelligent than those people in that weird period where people weren't obsessed with classicism, when really it's
That's right.
Quite a flourishing period that we're so indebted to. Probably a whole nother topic to discuss, but that's where we're coming from. But we have a rise in concern for the defense of Christianity and Christendom, which is the term for Christian Europe. We have kind of a consolidation of political systems after the crumbling of the Roman Empire in the West. And so you have a number of things happen which enable the West to go from being just defensive against attack to thinking, well, we need to push back and make our defense more territorially reconquest. We need to create bigger boundaries. We have to defend ourselves and our brethren. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
this was a time Christendom. What do you mean when you say Christendom? Was this the theocratic system of church and state being one?
Well, look, to an extent, yes, and George, but that's probably a little bit a simple way of saying it. We're talking about the integration of a civilization that spread across different kingdoms and duchies and territories that all follow the Christian religion. I mean, that's the idea, that there's a sense of, look, it's a bit like, the Roman Empire, that we're all kind of part of this Roman system of doing things. And we can't really talk about the history of Europe without referring to the Roman Empire.
Yeah.
But it's kind of the Christian reconsolidation of that notion that's based upon a shared worship of Jesus Christ as Christians, particularly Catholics. You have the Orthodox also appear during this time. So there are some schisms and strife that happens throughout history regardless. You have kingdoms fighting each other who are both Catholics. You have popes who make good decisions and bad decisions, but overall that's what Christendom means, the Christian
with the Pope at the head.
Yeah, well, the Pope at the head, in the sense that he's the head of the church. He's not the emperor as well. He has some territorial power which grows and wanes because of the circumstances he's in. Like the Pope becomes the ruler of a lot of Italy, the ruler of the Papal States of Rome itself.
Yeah.
By default, in a way, because the emperor's fizzled. He crowns Charlemagne as Holy Roman Emperor as a kind of a sign of the desire for Christian kings and princes to rule. But that doesn't mean he gives all of the former Roman territory of the Roman Empire to Charlemagne or Charles the Great. That's what Charlemagne means.
Yeah.
But this whole notion that the Roman Empire is constituted anew as a Christian undertaking, and that politics, that day-to-day life, including the defense of the innocent and warfare, which is unfortunately part of human civilization, is meant to be done in a Christian way. And there's a sense that is also in response to political strife, to the attacks by non-Christians. And we've got the Magyars, the Vikings, and a lot of different groups who eventually become Christian and miraculously seem to stop being so aggressive, happening at that time. The Saracens, which is a word for Islamic armies, comes a little bit later, but it's in that same vein of Christendom defending itself.
Yeah. So did the Pope have? I mean, it seems that the Pope has had a lot of political power. I mean, he was the head of the church. He would crown the kings of Europe, part of Christendom. Would they obey?
He would crown the emperor. Yeah. Sorry, I missed your last question.
Would they obey him politically?
No. So look, it's an interesting. It's hard for us to figure out because we are so used to a post-Enlightenment idea of religion, where we have this secular state, particularly in Australia, which is founded as a secular country very explicitly, no religion. That the idea that you could have religious figures have political power. You can have kings and princes and rulers and dukes and the local mayor and the local baron all being, all going to the same church as you and having authority over kind of churches in a way. But at the same time, having a figurehead who has control but not full control, which is the Pope. It's very hard for us to figure out. We're also used to a very centralized Vatican. The Vatican didn't exist in our sense, where after the Protestant Reformation became whatever, the Pope kind of runs the church very, very explicitly. So it's much looser. I think it's probably much better in a way, but the Pope is the head of the church. He governs the church. He doesn't always rule every part of the church, but he's kind of the final arbiter. He has very specific things to say sometimes about particular kingdoms or what happens. He has arguments with the emperor sometimes. He excommunicates kings who do the wrong thing. There's a whole variety of things go on in this period that is essentially, the fundamental idea is that imagine a world where your religion is an integrated part of day-to-day life, and people take it seriously, not just when you go to church on Sunday or say a rosary with your family at home, but as your mowing the lawn, as you're driving to work. The state really cares about how big and beautiful the cathedral is.
As a police officer pulls you over.
Yes, that's right. And you can argue over divine authority of the police officer or something anyway. You know what I mean? So it's actually not a bad example. But this idea that the cultus, the religious ceremony and belief is integrated. And once you have that, of course, the papacy has a lot of power. But at the same time, so do the local rulers have power within the church as well. And then you have the monasteries, which are being founded, and they're independent. A lot of them very, very, very wealthy because of their own efforts, but also very, very innovative, full of charity and looking after people. So you have the rise of universities. You have an enormous growth of a civilization, an amazing culture that is kind of the parent of ours, but it's quite different, particularly us in the kind of in Australia, a secular country founded by Anglicans who didn't like Catholics. So we've got a whole pile of removal, but we need to kind of understand the integration of church and state. There was a sense of the difference between church and state, but they were quite closely connected.
Excellent. So why were the Crusades called, and how were they called? So let's speak a bit about that.
Yeah, so I mean let's go through the history of the First Crusade, which is my particular expertise. And the First Crusade was called in 1095 at the Council of Clermont by Pope Urban II, who's beatified. And there's a couple of things going on at the time. I mentioned that we have had the Spanish knights fighting with blessings, so some kind of blessing for this kind of military activity to defend and reconquer Spain before this. And then we've had the fall of the Christian East, which happens over a period of time to the point where the Emperor Alexios Komnenos of Byzantium requests specific assistance. And so we have a sense of the growth of this idea that military experience, military training can be used in the service of God and the service of truth.
And that's what crusade means. So let's hone into what the word linguistically.
Yeah, it means taking the cross. So there's a ceremony that begins to happen where a cross and a blessing is given to those going on pilgrimage. It's an armed pilgrimage to Jerusalem. Later develops into any type of military activity for the defense of God and other defense of military activity in the name of God, in the defense of Christendom or Christians individually. The idea of crusading develops over time, but the fundamentals are there. It's a just war theory. It's not just war. It's also war in defense of others with a particular kind of blessing and idea. And that idea is plenary indulgences. As far as I can ascertain, the First Crusade is the first ever plenary indulgence. Now, let me explain plenary indulgence a bit more later.
Those who don't know them.
But so Urban II calls the First Crusade as part of a council, church council, like the Second Vatican Council or many others, Council of Clermont, and they request that the nobility of Europe take up arms on a pilgrimage to defend the Christians who are calling for aid from the Middle East, and to particularly liberate Jerusalem, which was considered the heart of the Holy Land, considered kind of the heart of the world in this kind of spiritual sense. And so they respond, and they go on crusade, as many do respond. Some of the leading knights of the First Crusade are very wealthy landowners. They're not just there was an idea floated around which is completely without historical evidence that there's just, oh, well, there was all these kind of bored knights who had nothing to do and, no money, and they wanted to just go on crusade to get money and wealth. Well, that doesn't, the historical evidence does not demonstrate that to be true. And so they go to Byzantium, and it's very clear that the idea is that they want to ally with the Byzantine emperor and re-establish Byzantine control of this area. And it's also part of a push to reunite the Eastern and Western churches, which had split. So you've got a number of different things that happening all at once, which great things often have.
Yeah. And this
So
is
that's explicitly why they went.
This is the Eastern Orthodox schism.
Yeah, so we have the Eastern the schism from between the Roman Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church, which was healed and broken again many, many times. It's something that throughout the Middle Ages is of great concern to the papacy that this rift is healed. And the Crusades are part of that effort. I think the Crusades aren't just for that, but it's definitely part of that desire for integration of the East and West from the schism.
So you speak about just war. So Pope Urban II called the First Crusade under the principle of just war.
Yeah.
That we're able in defense, if we're attacked or we have to liberate, and I'm sure you'll go into the idea that many pilgrims had to go to the Holy Land and create safe passages for them as well. So it was under the pretext of just war, in defense, in defense of being attacked, and also in the context of protecting pilgrims on their way to the Holy Land who would have been attacked by robbers and people ransacking them.
That's right.
Stealing their money. And we could speak about, the start of the banking system, by
That's
the Templars.
right. Yes.
Absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, very interesting.
You leave your money in one house, get a receipt,
and withdraw it in another Templar castle somewhere else. Yes, it's
fantastic.
What a phenomenal idea. Medieval ATMs.
You didn't have to carry your money, cashless society.
That's right. Yeah. But no, you're very correct, George. And I think in that little summary of some of the things you said there, one thing I always do with people is try and, again, which I have done before in this chat, is try and get people to understand what life was like in the Middle Ages. There were no police force to come in and, I've been attacked by Islamic pirates, call the United Nations, I'll come and, sort them out. You needed to protect yourself. You needed to protect your lands. Political power and political positions were part and parcel of military positions, which is pretty much throughout history, even to this day. Ours is just much more separated. We now have professional standing armies, and we have police forces and all these things. They didn't have them back then, but they had trained military, which was the knights. So they needed to defend people being attacked going on pilgrimage. And this isn't just ideas we have. We have historical evidence from written records, archaeological evidence of pilgrims going to Jerusalem and an increase in the oppression of pilgrims in the Middle East. So it's not just these kind of greater political ideas, if you even call them that, of helping the Byzantine Empire to reestablish itself. We've got some very specific thoughts about individual pilgrims going to the Holy Land, coming back with information. There are also European monasteries in the Holy Land that are very, very clear on what's going on over there. You have this real desire to both to liberate the church, and that word liberate is used in a lot of the monasteries in Europe to talk about how monasteries and the church should not be under the control of people who want to oppress it. So you have a bit of tension rising between, well, churches and monasteries should not be fully under the control of the local ruler who sometimes wants to take their money and take their land. And that flows on to, well, the churches and the holy sites in Jerusalem need to be free for Christians to come and worship there like they were before. So it's the oppression. There's the whole variety of things being mixed together. You've got kind of political oppression of the empire. You've got the oppression and attack upon Christians themselves and their patrimony, and the oppression and attack on physical things that are very important to Christians, like relics, churches, all those built these built manifestations of their religion that are sacred. We believe they're sacred, they're consecrated. We believe relics are really important. So that's what's kind of growing and thriving in this time. So of course they're going to eventually become, well, we're going to do something about this, and we have to do something about it. It's our duty, and it's God's call.
Hey, it's absolutely fantastic. So there is a strong pretext for the crusade to be developed. Now let's go through. Let's continue through the timeline and discuss.
George, can I just interrupt you? Something I forgot to say, and when you mentioned timeline, is the use of the notion of just war theory. Now that is developed after the First Crusade to its kind of the extent that we understand it today in theology, Thomas Aquinas. So crusading is part of the development of that theology, and we understand that as how the truth is unchanging, but our explanation of it and the way we work with it and explain it happens over time. So the Crusades are, if you use just war theory to look at the Crusades as a way of doing things, particularly the First Crusade and the Crusades to the Middle East, they kind of match up. It works, but there's something more than just war about the Crusades. It's a religious exercise. It's not just it's okay to fight people, which is just war. It's just okay. The Crusades are, this is a vocation. You must go and fight in defense of your fellow Christians. So
it's a vocation. I've never heard that before.
Yeah. It's the idea that this is the vocation of knighthood, to not to go around, despoiling each other, fighting each other, stealing from monasteries.
Yeah.
Your job as soldiers is to defend the church, defend the innocent, and defend fellow Christians. And this is where you need to go to do so. In fact, I mean, just because these were Christian men, these knights, and they weren't all bad, but some of them were naughty boys. We all know as a Christian, naughty boys can become good boys if they change, and the church's job is to just like you, George. No, George has always been a good boy. I've known him for a while.
I try to be.
But for instance, some of the Crusaders had been excommunicated before for what they had done to say steal money from monasteries or despoil some neighbor who they went to war with. So
or kill let's say innocent Muslims.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
camps or ransack people.
That's right. Yeah. So
that wasn't the intention of the crusade. It seems when you read textbooks today, high school textbooks, at least in my time, that's the picture you get, that the Crusades were called, the Pope called it, and they'd fight, and they give this image of just a hypocrisy.
They're religious nuts. They want out to get money. They hate, they're just bloodthirsty, mad people who just want to
committing
kill.
war crimes against innocent civilians.
Now, if you're an atheist and you don't believe that any of this is important, of course it's mad. But that's a whole nother topic, which I'm sure you've covered about, the existence of God and the existence of truth. But these weren't atheists. Neither were people they were fighting against. And even if you don't believe in God, you cannot, with the historical evidence, think that they were just out and about to kill people, to just go around and slaughter in the name of Christianity.
Let's extrapolate that principle to what happened in Bondi, the tragedy that happened in Bondi, and the heroic officer who ran to the aid and took the man down. I mean, I mean,
That's right.
can we parallel that the same principle?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's defense of the innocent. You can parallel many situations where violence has been used in the name of truth, or crusading as an act of love, which is a great article written by a professor from Oxford, Jonathan Riley Smith, who's I'll mention his name. He's one of the seminal modern historians who flipped on its head the idea that the Crusaders were out to get money or land or to violent.
Could you just repeat the author in the book?
Jonathan Riley Smith, crusading as an act of love, and he goes through the notion.
Crusading as an act of love.
Yeah, that's right, and he goes through the notion of the historical understanding from the Crusaders themselves and the papacy, and that crusading was considered a vocation to defend the innocent and to defend the church, and not what we're led to believe, whether incidentally or explicitly, that this is just kind of mad religious wars where people just were killed and thousands of people were killed in the name of religion, in the name of Christianity, just because they felt like it. The poor innocent Muslims were just, sitting at home, and along come the Christians to seek vengeance on them for not being Christian. Like, that is not what happened.
And just to expand
absolutely no way.
the empire of Christendom, I think that's a misconception as well.
That's
We're
right.
just trying to expand territory.
Yeah.
We're trying to liberate.
And I think the evidence is that notion of that's what the Crusades are. They come from Protestant anti-Catholic propaganda, which is a lot of stuff, anti-Catholic stuff that we get from our secularist what's the word? I want to say enemies, but our secularist critics. A lot of those ideas, whether it's like Easter is a pagan festival or all these kind of things, they're all things that were made up by Puritans or Protestants in general to discredit the Catholic Church after the Reformation. They're not based on historical fact. They're all very easily debunked, and you can trace it back to that anti-Catholic notion, a very, very clear desire to create a narrative where Catholics are bad. Catholics aren't Christian in many senses, and the Crusades are used as an example of that. There's a second thread, which is that the Crusades were, at some period, maybe in the 1800s, considered this great example of the victory of the West over the ignorant East, which is not true, okay? But it was promoted as that way. And then when you get a change of view as to what Christianity is, so Christianity is no longer, or the West is no longer considered to be the top of the pops, the best thing in the world, but that there's a change in that attitude, but not a change in the idea of what the facts are. So they believe that they were aggressively expanding territory into the Middle East and into Islamic lands, but they were rabid Christians wanting to kill. Both of those ideas are not based in historic fact. They are based in other desires to manipulate history to suit political or other purposes. The historical facts are what I've said before. It was very much a religious exercise based on defending the innocent and defending the church.
I mean, it's not fun as well. I mean, there's a plenary indulgence attached to it. Obviously, given that you're in the state of grace, you go on crusade, you take the cross with you. You're taking that cross with you, you receive a blessing, a commission, and you're ultimately going to your death, essentially.
And a lot of them did. And most of the Crusades failed even, and
exactly.
A lot of the Crusaders came back. They didn't stay there, a lot of them either, of course, which is a sign that it wasn't an idea you're going to go there and, conquer the promised land.
Especially after the fall of Acre, all the military orders left. Like the Hospitallers went to Rhodes and Malta. Now we have the Order of Malta. We can speak a little bit about that, I think.
Yeah.
But let's go into what happened at the First Crusade, I think, and then we'll go into discussing the military orders, because I find it very fascinating, especially yourself. a knight of the Holy Sepulchre,
Yeah, thanks.
um,
Yeah.
defending the sepulchre yourself in today's terms.
Yeah. Well, I'll try and give a very short history of the First Crusade, and then talk about the Crusades in general. You know, it's people can do their own
The
research for the
military orders,
details.
I think, because that's a very important
Yeah,
part.
and
The
then the military
spirituality
orders.
of
Yeah.
military orders. Yeah, is
And military
fantastic.
orders is a great example of what the Crusades were at their heart. So we have the First Crusade, and as I said, a lot of the nobility and their armies respond. They go to Byzantium,
Yeah.
and then they meet the emperor. The historical records of that are not fully clear exactly what they said, but there's a lot of work done in that, and it seems that they were planning to whatever they could do to reunite and with the Byzantine emperor Alexios Komnenos. They go into battle against the Turks, who had not too long before become Islamic. And they have many battles with them. They win some in amazing circumstances. There's one, the Battle of Dorylaeum, where they're on the march. They're kind of very exposed, and they're attacked by Islamic horse archers, who are not who are very different to the Crusaders, who are knights with lances in heavy armor, who are very powerful. If you end up on the end of their lance, you're a goner. But they're a lot more slow moving than the Turkish style of warfare. But what they do is, for instance, they pitch all their tents along their flank, so the horse archers can't get there, and then they defeat that army. They conquer Antioch, which is a big victory. And that's a number of years it takes to conquer Antioch. And then eventually they go down the coast to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is under the control of the Fatimids, which is the Egyptian Muslims. So they are lucky in a way that not all the Muslims are unified. When they do unify under the Ottoman Empire or under Saladin beforehand, they're pretty hard to beat. But
you have a great pronunciation of Salahuddin.
Saladin, yeah, I've
There you
been
go.
trying along many
There you
years.
go.
Aussies usually say
You're
Saladin.
you're an honorary Maronite, I think.
My grandfather was a Maronite, but I'll tell you that story some other day. Yeah, usually Aussies say Saladin, like Saladin, salad out, but no, Saladin. And so the Saladin hasn't turned up yet. He's a little bit later on, but they fight the Fatimids in Jerusalem. They lay siege to Jerusalem. Very bloody, very difficult battle, a very difficult siege. They conquer Jerusalem. It's a great moment. It's actually the only time Crusaders ever conquered Jerusalem. And I say conquered, I really mean reconquered, but in their own way. The first time the Western Crusaders conquered Jerusalem. And then they are attacked again by the Fatimids from Egypt, and they defeat them in the Battle of Ascalon. And that's when they consolidate their territories in the Middle East, around the Holy Land, Palestine, etc.
Known as the Crusader States.
The Crusader States, Outrammer, or the outer kingdoms, and there's Principality of Antioch, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, a number of different places. But during that time, particularly the Siege of Antioch, is the breakdown and a very sad result. Human history would be very different if this didn't happen. The Byzantine emperor abandons the Crusaders in one sense, and the Crusaders stuff it up themselves. So during the Siege of Antioch, it looks like the Crusaders are going to be defeated and completely decimated. At that time, there is with them a small contingent of Byzantines under a general named Tacticos, and he's like the representative of the emperor. The papal legate also dies, Adhemar of Le Puy. So you have that kind of person who's meant to control all the different leaders of the crusade into one. He dies. The Tacticos thinks that everyone's going to be annihilated. He escapes. Some other crusaders lose their nerve and run away. They meet the emperor on his way with his last army, his big army, to come and help them. He's told, turn around, you're going to be just decimated. There'll be no army left to defend Constantinople, and he turns around and he goes back. So
Okay.
you have then, it very much becomes a different political situation, and the whole plan of reuniting the East and West doesn't get completely decimated, but the Crusader states, they essentially do it themselves. They don't have that Byzantine integration. And it's real sad, really sad, because you would have had a very different situation going forward. So yeah, that's the First Crusade. It's a great victory. It's a phenomenal military from a military history standpoint. It's an amazing thing from a spiritual and historical standpoint. Nobody can really believe that they pulled it off, but they did.
But it would have required, it would have tested your faith. I mean, when you're being
oh yeah,
up against a physical threat,
yeah, yeah.
you're knocking on death's doorstep, and
And that's right. And these knights were essentially going into battle with nothing left most of the time, other than their amazing military prowess and what they believed and I believe to be God's blessing. And they were deeply religious people. They were constantly praying, constantly fasting, constantly doing penance, constantly repenting. That's all throughout the histories. For instance, when they laid siege to Jerusalem, they process around it 3 times, like ancient Jericho. And what happens? The consecration of a church, a number of things. They rescue relics. They have a big relic of the true cross they carry with them into battle. There's stories of visions in the sky of angels and saints being with them. It's a deeply religious experience, and they consider themselves to be pilgrims. They're referred to as pilgrims. They're not calling themselves crusaders. That's a later term. I can't remember when, but I mean that means taking the cross, in Latin crux. And yeah, so that's the experience that these men, predominantly men, took with them into the Crusades, and they form after this, they form a kind of a permanent situation, not just in the establishment of kingdoms, but also in the establishment of the Crusader religious orders, which are a great example of the mindset of what crusading was. So we can talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because so just to clarify, the people fighting the Crusades were ordinary knights from Europe, foot soldier, ordinary commoners, citizens who just became foot soldiers, knights, and then later, with the permanent situation in Jerusalem, particular orders, crusading orders, were founded, which were essentially religious orders with a military function.
Yep, that's
helping
like Shaolin monks of the Middle Ages,
if you could just imagine it, like these were monks with particular orders, but they also had a side job, which was to protect some pilgrims on horseback militarily, and also care for the poor. So they'd rotate between.
It's quite amazing, and very, I think it's unique, particularly in the Western world. And these were phenomenal warriors. I mean, from a point of view of, mere military training and prowess. I mean, 20 knights could shake. There's stories of the Battle of the Horns of Hattin. 20 knights considered enough to really shake the Islamic armies. One of the Byzantine princesses, I think it was her, she said a medieval crusading knight could charge through the walls of Babylon. That charge, that horse lance charge, was quite amazing. I'm talking about just Western knights in general. But yeah, you're right. So it wasn't just peasants, and a couple of poor knights who wanted to go and join in. We're talking about dukes, princes, and later kings and emperors who go on crusade. It's considered a vocation, a good thing to do for a period of time. And you're meant to go to Jerusalem or fulfill your crusading vow. And there are others who decide to become members of religious orders whose focus is to be knights, professed religious who are also knights, whose job it is to defend the Holy Land and to defend pilgrims. And the great ones we know of are the Hospitallers, or the Knights of Malta. That's where we get the St. John's Ambulance in Australia. Throughout the history, that's an example of where they've ended up. You have the Knights Templar, who are disbanded, and a whole nother story.
That's a whole nother episode.
Yeah, we won't do that. But in
Fantastic.
the 1400s, and they're very powerful, very strong.
Just the
phenomenal.
strength in battle, 15 knights outnumbered with armies, they could take down an army.
And absolutely fearless, and believe that what they're doing is God's will. And
it's not just physical strength, it was basically also their spiritual life manifested. They didn't care. They laid their lives out, and they fought.
And they were monks. They did the religious services, and they fought and they trained, and they defended the innocent. They founded hospitals. In the sense, the Crusades are the beginning of a more formal sense of what our modern hospitals are. And then you also have the famous German version, the Teutonic Knights, and you have the leper knights, the Knights of St. Lazarus. So if you're a knight, you're a leper. Of course, leprosy wasn't fully understood back then, but it was a disease and so knights who are lepers used their skills in their own group as crusading order of knights. And then you also have a number of orders in Spain too that are focused on
and also the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre as well.
Yeah, and the Order of the Holy Sepulchre is interesting because that is, we understand it to be knights who would do a year or two of service defending the Holy Sepulchre. Particularly, that was where they were headquartered.
The Holy Sepulchre.
Yeah, and it was a formal way of knights who don't permanently become celibate and join a religious order, but they are part of an order. And they go and defend the Holy Sepulchre for a few years, and then they rotate.
Because they were canons, essentially. They were part of their own religious order.
And so there were canons. Yeah, so there were priests, and then there was the knights. Yeah.
Okay,
so that's as far as we can ascertain.
Sorry, not all those orders were fully religious orders. Some of them have military functions, but they were living a religious life to a certain.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of them you would say that they are full-blown religious orders, but they were constituted in different ways. Like the Templars were constituted differently to the Order of St. John, etc. I mean, the Order of St. John, they're founded differently. The Order of St. John originally had hospitals in the Middle East to look after sick and traveling pilgrims, and eventually they needed to defend those hospitals, so they started knights. The Templars started out as knights wanting to defend traveling pilgrims, and eventually also started their own hospitals and things as well.
And the banking system that we know.
And the banking system, yeah. So I mean, to explain that, like the Templars were very popular, very powerful in a good sense. I mean, the word power, there's nothing wrong with having power as long as you use it for good, of course. And they'd have their establishments in the Holy Land, but also they have priories and monasteries and castles all throughout Europe where people would join and train. And because they were kind of independent from the local baron, they were very powerful and well armed and well trained. People would deposit their treasure with them. You didn't have bank transfer. You didn't have the money was physical, and so you deposit your valuables with them, and they would look after it for you. And often, people would donate lots of money to support the crusading effort. But if you're traveling, you could put 200 gold marks into the Templars Castle in London and travel to Rome or to Jerusalem and withdraw the marks there with a little check.
A little receipt with a seal.
That's right. And then we get kind of a Christian international banking system. I mean, that's an interesting tidbit. It's not it's kind of a demonstration, though, of the integration and intelligence of these people. They're not just buffoons going around knocking Muslims on the head. They are part of a system, and we see crusading go from its initial first crusade idea to becoming a Christian institution, not an institution that's all about, well, let's kill, but an institution to defend people, almost a standing army of Christendom. And that changes things. So imagine if Australia didn't have its own army, standing army.
Exactly.
We'd be having to constantly raise people to fight and defend. So so that's it's inevitable that happens. And they're truly international. They're filled with English people, French people, Spanish, German, Slavics, Italians. They're not nationally based either.
It's absolutely, it's a fascinating period. I think we can learn a lot from them spiritually that we can apply today, and we can take. I'm sure we'll have to do another episode to go through the complete history of the Crusades. It's definitely another episode. But for this episode, let's take 3 practical tools. What can we take from the principle of the Crusades, the lives of the Crusaders, especially the military orders who lived such beautiful lives, especially the Order of St. Lazarus, one of my favorites, who they contracted leprosy, so they lived their lives in seclusion, and they feared nothing in battle because they had nothing to lose. And the Templars who fought fiercely, and the Hospitallers who served in hospitals, it's such an inspiring time. How can we extrapolate that principle of crusade and apply it to our modern day? So what are some practical tools?
It's a great question, George. I think the first thing I'd say is pretty obvious, but it's worth reiterating, is our vocation as a Christian, as a man, perhaps as well, being, usually stronger and more powerful in our physical state, but just in general, our Christian men and women, is to give ourselves, we're called to give ourselves to defend the truth and defend the innocent, defend the defenseless. And it's not necessarily me saying that we all need to buy swords, even though that's a bit of fun, and go out and start, trying to reconquer Jerusalem. But St. Bernard of Clairvaux, when he was preaching the Second Crusade, is a great person to look into, and the whole notion of this spiritual battle that we are called to be.
Saint Bernard of Clairvaux.
And he was kind of the second crusade, the second wave of coming up with the crusade theology. But he's just an example of someone worth looking into for that kind of thing. But that whole notion of defending the innocent, of defending what is good and true, and not just with words, but with actions and our very lives. It's a most noble sentiment, and it's often quoted by the Crusaders. Greater love hath no man than to lay down his life for his friends. And we know the theology and meaning behind that. That was the Crusader idea. So that's number one. It's a big one, and it's replicable to every Christian and their state in life. And that's probably comes to the next idea, which is use our state in life as our path to sanctification and doing God's will. Knights were both made. Knights both chose to be knights, and were also made knights. Just like we both are called to be married. We choose to be married. We're called to be a priest. We choose to be a priest.
Yeah.
And there's all et cetera, et cetera. Called to be a school teacher, to be a plumber, whatever. I mean, that whole notion of using your vocation, that's not just becoming a monk or a nun or a priest, but in day-to-day life, is fundamental to the idea of crusading. And I think that's a really important thing to kind of discern how in our ordinary daily lives we are able to do something extraordinary and push ourselves in that state to do difficult things for God and for the truth. Very high sentiments for me to say. I'm not sure I live up to it, but you have a go.
But we're launching a crusade against our ego, our
that's right.
day-to-day struggles.
Yeah. But and then this isn't another tool, but something I'll say is that be clear and be aware that there are enemies out there. And not every person is fundamentally an enemy. They're all loved and created in the image and likeness of God, but there are people who align with ideas and or who have actions, who perform actions that are the enemy of God, the enemy of God's people. They wish to do us harm. And this is not me trying to create fake, fear or stoke alarm, stoke alarm or create.
I mean, the devil exists.
The devil exists, and the Crusades are an example of essentially Christ fighting Satan, and we are called to do that. And we're called to name and not be afraid of, physically, whatever that means in the context of defending what is true and good and innocent. So, I mean, that's, it should be said, because sometimes people think this is all just an intellectual exercise. But if you go through the history of martyrdom, you go through the history of Crusades, you go through the history of what's happened, we all know that the easy, cushy little life we have in Australia may not last forever, and we know that's definitely not the experience of most people in the world. And sometimes you got to be ready in some way, and whether it's some catastrophe, some violent catastrophe, or whether it's speaking up in the public square or whatever it is, we have to be ready to be clear.
So we have to be ready. This is a spiritual battle, but also sometimes where we're called to defend. It needs to be done. I mean, war, First World War, Second World War. These were the answers, the pinnacle of pillar of
standing up for your family when they're being treated badly, all these little things, and you got to work out the best thing to do, and it's all part of the the virtue of prudence and prayer and having good mentors like like the Pope and onwards, and guides. But it's worth saying that. But I mean, the third little tool, George, is kind of thinking of the Crusaders' love for the consecrated things of the church that God's given us, for relics, for churches and consecrated ground, for those things, not just the people. And I think the people are important, those baptized Christians and other and all innocents, but also a love for those those things which God has made holy. And for whatever reason throughout history, he has ordained to be particularly holy places. The Holy Sepulchre being par excellence of the greatest physical location in the history of the world. That's it. That's where it was. It was destroyed by Islamic rulers, and they went to defend it. And I mean, me being a knight of the Holy Sepulchre, that's particularly in my mind, that we defend the innocent, we defend Christendom, but we also defend those things which God himself has, those items and those places which God himself has consecrated through his church or personally.
Daniel Hill, thank you so much for being with me here tonight on the show. And it's been absolutely wonderful conversation. I think we definitely need to have another episode to continue through the full history of the Crusades. There's a lot more to unpack. There's a lot more to discuss. I'm sure we can discuss it at another time. But thank you for being with me here tonight on the show.
Thank you, George. And for all those watching or now or on a recording, do some research, read up on the Crusades. There's a lot to learn. I like Wikipedia. A lot of people think it's silly, but Wikipedia is pretty good to get a general idea of how things happen. There's maybe a bit of anti-Christian bias there, but not much. Get a sense of what happened in the history of Christianity, and don't just go with the vibe you get from the media or from your textbooks. Do your own research. There's plenty of information out there. And you can learn the history of First Crusade and all the others. And there's lots of interesting things, lots of good guys, lots of bad guys, and a lot of in between.
So thank you for tuning into the show. Don't forget to go to thecatholictoolboxshow.com That is thecatholictoolboxshow.com. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast wherever you get your podcasts on every single platform. Thank you for tuning into the show. I'm your host and founder, George Manassa. Until next week, God bless, take care, and take action.
In this era of grave spiritual crisis, it is not enough to simply know about your Catholic faith. That is why we need a Catholic toolbox to equip us with the practical skills necessary to live our Catholic faith to reach our ultimate goal, which is heaven for all eternity. Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves. Do what it says. Join us every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. for the Catholic Toolbox as we hand you the tools to go forth, live the faith, and change our modern world today. Live on the Voice of Charity.